Well, I'm extremely glad to be here at Georgia Tech finally. As Rich said, a couple of different invitations, and we're trying to make it all work. So it's great. It's great to be here. The title of my talk is "Not Invented Here," and you'll understand that as we go. But let me just start with a little bit of an introduction about where I'm coming from. So I started working in the intersection of technology and higher ed in the mid-1990s, 1994, with the start of JSTOR. I was the first employee, so did a little bit of everything there. And you know, the experience of seeing how technology has impacted higher ed over basically 20 years informs a lot of where I'll be coming from in speaking today. But the organization that I work at, Ithaka, has these three different units in it. It's JSTOR, as Rich said, the largest, Ithaka S&R, where we're doing research on the impact of technologies on higher ed, and Portico, which is a long-term digital archive of scholarly content. And so at some level, you can see JSTOR and Portico as kind of operational entities that are providing a service to higher ed related to the changing technologies. And Ithaka S&R conducting research and helping people to understand these things better. This has been incredibly valuable to me. I have the good fortune of working kind of for and with all of these enterprises. So on one day, I might be very focused on the operational challenges of changing the culture at JSTOR to address the changing environment. And the next day I might be, working at Ithaka S&R, talking to higher education institutions about things that are changing. And these things constantly inform each other for me. And that'll be part of the perspective that I bring on the topics that I'm going to talk about today. So very quickly, I'll talk a little bit about where these ideas come from that I'm going to be addressing today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some definitions and to try to focus what I'm really interested in discussing. I'll talk about results from a University System of Maryland study that we did that came out a few months ago in Ithaka S&R. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about barriers to adoption of technologies in the learning space. So first, the sources of information, the sources of what's going to be talked about today. How have I learned what I'm going to talk about today? How am I going to express it? And when I do this, I do it with a considerable amount of humility. I'm not a faculty member. I'm not a person who's run a university. So when I talk about these things, I'm sharing observations from the perspective of someone who's worked in this territory for a long time, but at some level you could say has worked outside the institutional context of a university. So in that sense, I'm an observer of that, and I'm an observer that brings a perspective around, if you will, entrepreneurial startup enterprises, not-for-profit enterprises that serve the scholarly community. So the first source is the interactive learning online, the randomized trial study that we did evaluating, where we did a rigorous study with over 600 students in using a statistical system, OLI, from Carnegie Mellon, and testing and comparing outcomes from that, using that course in a hybrid mode as compared to a traditionally taught course. I'll talk a little bit in detail about the University System of Maryland study. I'll come back to that. Also informed by a study that we did with something called the Public Flagships Network, a kind of a coalition of mostly Big Ten universities, Big Ten-like universities, or CIC, Ohio State, Minnesota, University of Texas, where we went in and interviewed faculty, deans, and chairs of departments about their perceptions and expectations with respect to online learning. We've done a series of institutional case studies on these, and the general research experience and reflection of our senior advisors. Our senior advisors include Bill Bowen, who's written extensively on higher ed over a long time. I've worked with him for almost, over 20 years. So I benefited greatly from constant email dialogue at all hours of the day and night. And Larry Bacow, who's also a senior advisor. We've worked with Britt Kerwin. So people who are, have long histories in higher ed, and I'll reflect some of their views, but I'll try to mention when the views are theirs and not necessarily mine. So let me talk for a moment about the focus of the talk. So often people are talking about MOOCs or online learning or retention rates or all these things. they're talking about issues and they talk by each other because they're not working on a same definition set of the actual problem that's being discussed. So I'm going to take a few moments, I hope, to try to share how we are thinking about it at Ithaka and how I'm thinking about it here today. So first I'm going to talk about markets, and what we're really focused on right here are markets in the sense of how is online learning being delivered. So if you talk about a business to consumer offering, to use the internet parlance, the institutional professor creates an online course on a learning platform which is delivered directly to individual students out on the web or out in the world. So it's a direct consumer offering. You're gonna create that product in such a way that it goes directly to the students and benefits them in some way. I would say the master's program in computer science here at Georgia Tech is similar. I mean, it's reaching out to students outside of the context. I'll contrast that with a business-to-business offering. That is, I create a course, and the intention of that course is actually to be delivered by another institution, by faculty members, to students on a campus that are trying to get a credit or trying to get a degree. So contrasting a product or a service that is going to other institutions to help the faculty and in the end help the students learn more effectively. And we have been focused at JSTOR and Ithaka from the beginning on the notion that technology could help improve things and make them less expensive. So we're really focused on that goal. So if I represent the space graphically, Rich mentioned I'm an engineer. I tend to oversimplify things. So if you think of this as a four-box matrix with business, the individuals, if you will, on the lower part of the y-axis, institutions on the upper part of the y-axis, and supply and demand or consumption across the x-axis. You have different environments. So in the first, the lower environment, this is really where the MOOCs are, right? Because your faculty are creating courses, and edX, Coursera, Udacity are creating a platform that allows those courses to be delivered to individuals online. So the demand side of that, where the students are actually learning, is down in this box. Over in this box, this is where the faculty are creating those courses in that cool black room next door, creating a course that then gets delivered in that way. This space is the space that we're really focused on here, the upper right quadrant, which is where you would have someone, it's going to happen less probably in the short run at Georgia Tech. A faculty member at Georgia Tech is using courseware or a platform or content created somewhere else to teach the students that are trying to get a degree at Georgia Tech either more effectively or for lower costs. So that's the area. So in a sense, a business-to-business offering, and this is the consumption side is working through the institution to students that are getting a degree at that institution. So we're focused on this, and the reason that's really important, so for example, you will hear a lot of concern expressed about the very low percentage of students in MOOCs that finish, right? What's the percentage of students that complete in a MOOC? Well, that's in this quadrant here. Has nothing to do with this one up here, except to the degree that this part feels threatened by perhaps some students going that way, and that's not a substitute. But in reality, the students taking this, the individuals that are doing that are doing it for a whole set of different reasons. It's a different marketplace. It's a different set of activities. So I would say that that's an example of the ways that things can sometimes get confused. So we're going to focus on that area, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that we did at Ithaka S&R, where we worked with the University System of Maryland, and the idea was to test the way that upper right quadrant might operate. So in other words, how might faculty at system institutions in Maryland use MOOCs or other kinds of hybrid or online technologies from outside the university system to teach courses to students within the system that were getting credits. And the idea was to evaluate the impact on the student outcomes, like how did the students do? We try to create some comparisons, A/B tests, if you will, of students taking the course from the content from outside and compare that to the traditionally taught course. Understand the implementation opportunities and the challenges of doing that. How did that work? What were the problems? And gain insight into the impact on costs, like to try to model how costs might be impacted. So the study design was we asked faculty to volunteer, faculty around the system. We said, hey, we're going to do this study. Here's what we're going to do. We want you to use courses from these MOOC providers or from these other sort of systems and use them on your campus to teach your students. We had about 25 or 30 volunteers. We figured out over time which ones were best fit. We selected some. We went forward. And depending on the way the course went, we may or may not have been able to do a side-by-side comparison to test the outcomes. So when we couldn't do that, we called them case studies. And we had a few that were actual randomized trials. So quick to the outcomes. The students did equally well in each of the different modes. That is, the same types of students did equally well in terms of their learning outcomes. And that was true of the subcategories as well. This shows a distribution of the students. We didn't do randomized trials, but we then compared the students in the two different categories to see if they were similar in their distribution in terms of their various characteristics, and they were. So as I said, the outcomes in terms of the score on the post-test and also in their pass rate were comparable, slightly better in the hybrid course, but not statistically better. They basically performed equally. There were, in the 7 courses that represented, there's 1,600 students that were in this test. The hybrid formats used less class time. The students spent less time in class. They also spent, by self-reporting, spent less overall time, but we were really tracking the time spent in class. And these outcomes are consistent with other of the rigorous trials and studies that have been done. I mentioned earlier the OLI statistics test that we did, but some others that have been cited in the literature where these hybrid courses have done equally well. Important thing to say is the students liked, in this particular case, they liked the hybrid class less. They preferred the face-to-face course. And I won't get into speculating on the reasons for that, other than to say that it was rocky in the sense that Coursera courses and the other courses they weren't linked into the student information systems. There were a lot of technical glitches, passwords, things like that were kind of a hassle during the process of doing this, because I have to always thank Daphne and Coursera for participating in this, because they really weren't, the system wasn't set up to do this, and so they had to do a lot of work to just make it work. So there were a lot of benefits. Qualitatively, our findings show that for one, it's obviously a self-selected group, volunteers. The faculty really enjoyed the experience. They nearly all of them said they would do it again, and they saw it as professional development in teaching, as many of the people who teach with MOOCs find, but this also on that side. They liked actually having to dig into the way somebody else taught their course, that they felt like they learned a different way of thinking about it. It was kind of an intellectual conversation about how to teach the topic. And sometimes the courses were specifically set up in such a way that they were purposefully set so that the faculty member could teach something that wasn't right in their strike zone, that wasn't their specific expertise, so it enabled them to do that. They had more flexibility, the use of face-to-face time, and some really appreciate the opportunity to replace the textbook because they're concerned about the costs of textbooks for their students. This is just one quote, obviously beyond anecdotal, just to give you a sense of what one of the faculty members said about having the opportunity to teach in this way. Now, so I think it was challenging, but it was positive for most of the participants in the study. But we did highlight there were a lot of challenges that came up in the course of trying to do this. First, as a faculty member, sometimes there was a poor fit between the online materials and the program needs. And when we set out to do this, obviously people are learning all the time, and in general, talking to people here at Georgia Tech that are working on these things, everybody's breaking down courses into more modular units, pieces and parts that they can reassemble. At this point, Coursera was delivering courses, so the faculty member had to decide, am I going to use the whole thing to teach this course? Am I going to use the whole novel, or am I going to use chapters or pieces? And So sometimes that fit wasn't great between exactly the curriculum the faculty member wanted to teach in the course. Sometimes it wasn't a fit for the student type. It was either too hard or too easy. And so that was something that the faculty had to work on. A big part was a feeling like the faculty struggled to make sure the students were actually doing the work outside of the classroom in the online environment. Lots of technical issues came up, as I said earlier, with authentication, with integration with the learning management systems. And finally, intellectual property concerns came up. I'll pause here and tell a little story. In the process of working on this, there was a faculty member who said it was okay to use his course for this test. And so two professors at one of the small comprehensive state universities in Maryland prepared for using that course in their class. And they got all ready over the summer. And during that period, things got very controversial around MOOCs. And so the faculty member decided they didn't want the course used to, it was perceived that this was to test whether or not the course could be used to lower costs, quote unquote. And so, so the faculty member didn't want to have anything to do with that, given the controversy that was going on the web, and said, no, and this is literally 2 weeks before the semester began, and said, no, I don't want the course used in that way. Well, it raises the question, it raised the question in a very practical way, who gets to make that decision? Did the faculty member have the right to make that decision? Did the institution enter into the agreement with Coursera, and therefore the course could have been delivered? Did Coursera have any role to play in that decision? Did we, the study facilitator, if you will, have any role to play in that decision? There was nothing to document that, and even if it had been documented, would the institution, now let's say the institution had control and the faculty member really didn't want to be a part of it, would the institution have told the faculty member, you must let this course go? You all can come to your own conclusion. In the end, we did not use the course. And in fact, the irony was that the faculty members that this faculty member was trying to protect, if you will, were the ones who wanted to use the course. They wanted to be able to use the course in that way. They had to redo their whole course in a couple weeks, and it highlights, it's not meant to be raised as any kind of a criticism of anyone in this picture. It highlights the importance of the intellectual property. And when I go to the next slide and talk about costs, the costs of preparing the course, the amount of time that these faculty members spent to prepare for this course, to use the content from somewhere else, was significant. I mean, in order to adapt to their course. And there's a big difference between the average and the median, because we had one faculty member who spent reported 500 hours preparing for this course. That's a lot of hours. But the point is, it does take a lot of time to work these things into, and so you're going to want to amortize that. You're going to want to be able to use that in multiple years. So what about the persistence of the course? I mean, if you're going to depend on content that's coming from somewhere else, how do you know it's going to continue to be there as a faculty member? That's a really important question. It's an important question from a pedagogical point of view, from a teaching point of view, from the standpoint of long-term costs. We asked the faculty if it saved time, and some said yes, some said no, and some said maybe in the future. So it was kind of didn't really give a strong sense. So our feeling was that to summarize, we did there were comparable outcomes from a standpoint of student learning, and faculty spent less time in the classroom. There's something to be learned there potentially about the cost of delivery, but we don't have anything to say that it confirms one way or the other. Better ways to use these materials is needed. If you think of this as a way of talking about what does it take to do this, I felt like we ended up with a lot of data and evidence that would be very helpful to a company or an organization that was trying to provide this service as a service to other institutions. Scaling it up locally, I mean, it really requires real commitment on behalf of these institutions. So there needed to be really strong leadership at Maryland to make this happen. And that, intellectual property issues are really important to think about in terms of system-wide scaling of these. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about some of the barriers in a little bit more of a structured way. I'm going to start with some of the faculty concerns that came up, and then some of the local institutional issues, and then some of the system-wide cross-institutional issues that come up when you think about doing this. Again, talking exclusively about that upper right quadrant, that quadrant where an institution is using technology/content courseware from outside to teach students in classroom. So first, the faculty concerns. Related to obviously some concerns about cost cutting or potential reduction in the ranks of tenure track type faculty. That's an important question, an important issue that needs to be raised and dealt with. The expectation that that effective teaching requires face-to-face interaction, and this question of whether or not the online can supplement or even replace some of that. Obviously, faculty are concerned about that. There's the issue of change and new skills that need to be acquired to use these effectively. It's a different thing to use content from elsewhere to teach your students, and that both requires time to develop those skills and also perhaps even some assistance from others. I think a really important thing is faculty want to own that experience with their students. They know their students locally. They feel it's important to own that experience, and the use of content and video lectures and some of the curricular direction that comes from these external courses can sometimes feel like a threat to that ownership of the experience for the students. And so there's a strong desire to be able to customize both the content that's provided to the students and the nature of that experience. And many of the systems have not had that capability to do that sort of updating and customization. And frankly, the Coursera system that we're using in this very, very limited opportunity to do that. So that's an important thing that has to be overcome. But I think the faculty issues, such as they are, I think are really important. But I don't think that this is about faculty resistance to change or faculty resistance to trying new things for their students. I mean, I think we had very enthusiastic faculty right from the get-go that wanted to be engaged in this. So I don't think that a lot of the press can make it seem like it's an issue of faculty not wanting it or like it's a battle between faculty and administrators. I think the faculty, from what we can see in our experience, they absolutely want to do these new things, but there's some very real challenges to doing it effectively. So putting those concerns aside about the faculty, what are some of the institutional issues that come up? One thing that comes out very strongly from the work that we've done in a lot of our interviews on the campuses, and this is perhaps it's not a very profound statement, but as an observer going in and talking to faculty at research universities, at a lot of different places, very high quality places, et cetera, there's really a difference when you're there between how the institution looks from the inside out as compared to outside in. And there's a real gap between the way that those perceptions. So in other words, I mean, it's like I said, it's not a deep statement. Everyone on the outside, whether it's legislators or parents, et cetera, are concerned about tuition costs and education of people delivered by these universities. But when you talk on the campus, and I'm not trying to get into a big thing here, but when you talk to the faculty, the focus really is on the research side of it. That it's not to say that faculty aren't interested in the teaching, but clearly the incentives and the funding models and everything in the institutions are aligned that way. So you have a gap between the funding models from the outside, the legislatures, the tuition, where that money is coming from, and the perception internally about the way the faculty are incented on the campuses. And that gap is in a large measure creating some tension. The other thing I think is a really important question to continue to address is often called bundling, and this notion of research and teaching being bundled. And so there's one question about whether research and teaching really needs to be bundled at the institutional level. Like we need institutions where both research and learning and teaching is happening. That's a different question from whether each faculty member ought to be both a great researcher and a teacher. And obviously we're seeing that pressure. We see that pressure in all areas on the web where the network is coming in, where roles are being broken up into part roles, right? And clearly institutions are struggling with this, but I think it is kind of a question that needs to be raised a little bit more directly about the nature of that bundling and the degree to which it's sustainable. Now, a lot of what has happened has been not necessarily proactive or chosen, but reactive in the development of the adjunctification, more adjunct faculty teaching, and in some institutions, there's a real movement now toward identifying master teachers or teachers that are going to specialize in teaching that have a great work ladder and great opportunities for all the benefits, actually embracing the fact that we're not necessarily going to look for that to be bundled. And that's happening in a lot of places, but I think it's also not happening at places, and I think a real conversation about that would be valuable. A second issue, obviously, can be really controversial, are the questions of shared governance and faculty governance. And what I would like to say here is to try to offer the goal to not have this be an adversarial situation between the faculty and administration around sort of typical sort of labor management questions, but rather the thing that I feel like I've noticed in the conversations is that we don't actually have a situation where the faculty and the administrators have a shared understanding or shared evaluation of the problem. Forget about the solutions, what should we do about it, but actually the problem. And what I mean by that is that, for example, when you talk to institutions, when we've talked to faculty at institutions, and the faculty are engaged in the use of these technologies on campuses, they're focused really on improving student learning outcomes. They're focused on being better teachers, and that's all fantastic and wonderful. One of the big challenges for institutions is how to do that at lower costs, or how to do that for more students, or to do it more productively. But if you ask the faculty that question and say, are you thinking about how these technologies might be used both to increase the outcome, improve the outcomes of the students, and also reduce the costs or figure out how to do this more productively, it's not that they're hostile to that notion or no, that's a bad thing. It's literally just not on the radar. At least that's my impression, that the notion of whether faculty are thinking about how do we do this in ways that would lower the cost of delivering this instruction, that doesn't seem to be on the radar, and that's not said as a criticism of faculty. It's literally they're protected from that. Faculty have been purposefully protected from that in a way. So I think that one goal would be just if you can get what is an important problem of the university to be a shared problem of the absolute key institutional staff players for the institution buying into that as being a problem is important. More broadly, I think the technology is obviously hungry for scale. I mean, the economies of scale and other things. And so we're entering a realm where in the old days, untethered from any of the network and all that, a faculty member just taught a class and had all the tools at their disposal to teach that class however they wanted to. And obviously we're moving beyond that. I mean, I spent time with Pam before this meeting talking about what's the process for creating some of these online tools and some of these things. It's a team effort. It involves substantial resources from the host institution, from the university. And so that leads to decision making that is wider, broader than the individual faculty member first, broader than the department, broader than the school, broader even possibly than the university going to the system-wide level. And so the question is, how do governance structures that have evolved and been created over time in a different environment, how well do they map across to this environment where there's more breadth around these decisions? And I think the value of true shared faculty governance in this is critical because it's the faculty who are in charge of the learning of the students, but it's not as possible anymore to just separate these out as like delegated governance, like faculty have this part and administrators have that part. I think it feels more important to have that be truly shared. Uh-oh, that's not good. Oh, well, that's a brief problem with PowerPoint, so let's try that. I don't want to send a message to Microsoft. And let's see if she comes back here. Let's try. They're going to let me open that guy? Wow, that was strange. Huh. Oh, that's not good. Yeah, I know. Bad choice. All right. All right, we'll have to get the fast speed dial here. Hold on one sec. Okay, you get to see it all again. I could have just jumped to it, but okay. What you said that the NSA didn't like. I don't know. I don't know. Governance, shared governance does it every time, I guess. So institutional issues number 2 is this question of costs, and I think I mentioned it already, so I won't go into it in great detail. But I think, like I said, that generally speaking, faculty are focused on their areas and their specific disciplines, and therefore are not engaged on this question of costs. And in many cases, the universities have not needed to in the past have very granular cost accounting measures to really understand the cost of delivering a particular course or what it takes to do that. And so it's been hard, it is hard to measure the changes and the impact on costs. And obviously there are certain things that are in place, structural, a big part being the physical facilities that were designed for one purpose, and now we've got a different purpose. I mean, nothing could be like a more tangible, dramatic example of that. Like here we're in a room that's very conducive to however we might want to use it, right? We can have me up here in the traditional way talking about what I may know and sharing with you all, but we have these modular tables around here for engagement, very different from an auditorium with 200 seats and pull-up tables. And so, I mean, the whole institution, everything about the institution is going through that change. It's most tangible when you think of it in terms of the space, but those spaces that were created to do a particular thing are not set up to do another thing. And I think that's very true of obviously our whatever it's our technology infrastructure, our cultural aspects, our processes all need to adapt to this different kind of environment. Another big issue, and I'll talk about this one as a cross-institutional issue because I think at the end of the day, this is one that is also very, very dependent on scale, is the question of data and the management of data, learning data, behavioral data. So if, and connected to that are the issues of privacy, which are very important issues in the university context. Librarians have been leaders on concerns about data privacy, and it's a huge issue. So I'll talk about it in a couple different perspectives. First, I think we've seen that that the ability to use data to improve systems is huge on the web, and whether it's Google or Facebook, that machine learning that's used to improve the quality of the systems is critically important. And now with students engaging in online learning, they're leaving a trail of their activities and their behaviors and interventions that happened. And so that data, those data can be used to improve the system. So that's constant feedback loop. If we think about it in the most benevolent way, and not think about it for a moment in ways that are kind of nefarious, but actually that the data that if you have, I mean, it's no different than what a really great teacher does. If you have thousands of students that went through this process and these interventions cause these outcomes in different ways, the degree to which you can feed that back into the system and continuously improve upon it is huge. And in fact, if institutions of learning are not able to get access to those data, they will be at a serious disadvantage in improving learning vis-a-vis or compared to those who do have those data. So, so I think it's really important to figure out, making sure that one can capture the data, so that can be handled in agreements with providers, and can Georgia Tech, I'm sure Georgia Tech has provisions in its agreements with its various providers that it can get the learning data from the platform providers. So once you have access to those data, well, what can you do with them? It's not a trivial matter to take those data and actually have them be analyzed and useful for informing future decisions about how to teach. So there's a question of whether you have the rights to those data, whether you physically get those data, and then whether you have the capacity to use them. But the bigger question is that the reality is this is a scale game. So even if Georgia Tech has those data for Georgia Tech students, it's going to be those who have all the data, millions of students or thousands and thousands of students in particular areas, constantly going through these courses that are going to inform. So how does one think about the notion of getting access at the supra-institutional level, cross-institutional level, to be able to learn about how students are learning in these new environments? And those are going to require a cross-institutional cooperation, collaboration, and obviously some kind of leverage with those providers that are gathering those data, where I think that those data represent a strategic, a competitive advantage, if you will. That if you were running one of those enterprises, you'd be thinking carefully about whether or not the degree to which or the nature in which you shared those data. Finally, I think that we have to protect student privacy in this process and removing identifiable information. At the same time, we need the data to be able to do longitudinal studies on the impact and how students learn. So it's a real challenge, and I think it's going to be very important for colleges and universities to figure out what level of comfort they have with collecting these data. I think that right now it's extremely conservative. And so it's very hard to move forward on some of the research that one might want to do, whether it's IRB or data privacy issues with general counsels, et cetera. And I think that commercial firms obviously are moving much faster in using those data. So I think, again, it's going to be important to figure out what the right balance is between protecting the privacy and using the data to improve learning outcomes. And finally, I think I think some of the issues that I've tried to address are aimed at least in terms of this question of the gap between the external perception of higher ed and the internal view of higher ed. I think there's work to do to reestablish public trust in higher ed. We've got a lot of hostility, unfair, I think, hostility toward higher ed and what's going on, and that real work needs to be done there. I think that one of the other big challenges that's a cross-institutional one, and you all are dealing with it in the system-wide university system of Georgia. We've seen it in the other state universities where we've been, is creating great pathways for students to move from community colleges in through the institutions and doing that effectively. It's one thing to say that the credits can transfer. That's great. It's another thing for the experiences of those learners in those first 2 years to actually be comparable to the experience that the students have at an institution like Georgia Tech, and making sure that they are then well prepared to take upper level courses here or at other institutions. So I think there's there's a lot of work to be done there. And I'll conclude with one story about IP, because I think intellectual property and working this out is going to be very important. Up to now, I think institutions have largely been in an experimental mode and therefore have not really had to make hard agreements about ownership of intellectual property or control of it. And obviously in higher ed, the range of the spectrum goes from patent and trademark kind of things where institutions typically own it, that's the default, and then royalties are shared with faculty, to the other extreme, which is copyright and textbooks and faculty work, which is assumed to be owned by the faculty on that end. The question is where this courseware stuff that's built by with resources from the institutions, where does it fall on that spectrum, and how do we think about that question? And it's not always about the money. It's not, the faculty maybe have no interest in necessarily getting paid for that. The issue, it gets to these issues of control that I talked about and how you can get into an environment of persistence. So I'll just close with I said, one story to try to illustrate the point. So a lot of my background is from working at JSTOR, and in the analog world before digital resources, before 1993, 4, whatever, you bought a book or you subscribed to a journal, and the book came to the institution, or you bought a textbook, and the book came to the institution. It was used. It's untethered from anything. It's free and clear. It's all by itself. And so, yeah, there's some rules about it. You're not supposed to copy it. There are copyright issues in the law, et cetera. But basically, you have it. You can do whatever you want with it. It's there. So now come along electronic resources. And so JSTOR, we digitized all the books, and we put them online and people can access them, and it's incredibly valuable, and that's all to the good. But when you think about it, that's completely tethered by the network. It's completely connected. I mean, I could never do this, but literally physically, one could turn it off. Like if we just turned off all the servers that we have, we could turn them off. And no one in the world in 5 seconds would have access to any of that content. So the point of that is to say there have to be rules then. There have to be rules that make it unacceptable, illegal, whatever you want to call it, for us to make that choice. So you have to have license agreements. You have to have things that set up that this is going to be around, that people can count on it, that it can be persistent. So the same thing is true here. So the experience of teaching a class is like that book. It's untethered. You go in, you have your resources, you teach that class. It happens, it's over. Now we're talking about things where people are having their class videotaped, that they're creating learning modules, they're creating assessments, they're creating the things. And somebody in that, if I take someone in that upper right quadrant, wants to use those to teach their students. It's just like that electronic resource. I need it, I depend on it, now I need rules. I need to know that if I'm going to use that, it's going to persist in the future. It's going to continue to be there. I can make use of it. And when you can do that, then there will be possibilities for improving learning outcomes through that, maybe doing things faster, maybe doing things a little bit better. But unless we have that infrastructure, that environment, which will eventually happen because there's going to be demand for it. But until we have that, we've got to make those rules. We've got to figure those things out, just as the institutions, and we worked with institutions, had to figure out what's the licensing terms that would make it possible for an electronic journal to be relied upon and be useful. So I think I'll just conclude there and open it up for Q&A, and just say that it's one of the things about coming to Georgia Tech is I got a chance to learn about all the innovation that's happening here, and it's truly incredible. And then when I come to a room like this and I think about just the way that these institutions are changing, it gives me more hope and excitement about the future and what is going to be happening. For students, I got a 9-year-old. When he comes to college, it's going to be very different than it is now. So thank you very much.
I've got a question to remake. The Maryland study, in fact, just a lot of the AB studies that I've seen, did you talk about making the study implicitly longitudinal? Here's what I mean. So you've got courses, the bricks and mortar courses, probably the 20th time those courses have been offered.
At least, probably, yeah.
And then you have the first time blended courses. So you're comparing a mature offering versus something that's going to evolve over time. I wonder if the outcoming part of the experiment was already promising, but I wonder if in the student experience part of the study, it wouldn't have been a fairer comparison to do 2 semesters, to do do back to back. What happens the second time the course is off? Presumably it's improved.
Yeah, that's a problem. Presumably, I think you're exactly right. I think we, in an ideal world, and basically my short answer to your question is we'd love to do that. It's costly, and you have to find the resources to be able to do it. Money, time. I mean, it's one of the frustrations related to this whole area, that the research on learning outcomes is expensive to do. It's hard to instrument it right. It's hard to get great comparisons, and it's hard to find the resources to pay for it. And so consequently, there isn't enough of it done. And I think there'd be more. I would, it was challenging for the USM people. It was challenging for Coursera. For us, it was a lot of work. So there's a tendency to like, oh gosh, it's a one-off. Let's get this done. But it's clearly not what you'd want it to be. There's a guy named Bror Saxberg at Kaplan leads their research work, and what they're trying to do there is to create if you will, a constant evaluative infrastructure and environment around. And at Kaplan they're teaching things like standardized test performance and things. So in effect, trying to create a constant randomized trial that you can just go over and over again to get that longitudinal data, and that would be wonderful to do. So, frankly, if we could have done this as a 5-year project and had the resources to stay with it over and over, it would be much better. And in fact, I wish there were more studies. And I think what we have to do is try to figure out economical ways to do the best we can, given the resources that are available. You want to do it in a rigorous way so that you really understand what's happening. But it is hard, and even there, it's challenging. I mean, some level, what are you really comparing to? And what I mean by that is not just that we don't necessarily know the quality of the outcomes of the face-to-face, but in all these studies that we've done, we were comparing to multiple instructors. So even the comparison set was an inconsistent set, right, that you were comparing to. So I think that's something that we just have to keep working on. Hopefully foundations will support this kind of research, and institutions will want to do this kind of research because it's critically important to see the delta year after year, because I think we assume that it's going to get better, but it would be better to know.
Yeah, I mean,
to have evidence.
Occurred to me, David, are you so we're now multiple iterations into some of our and are we tracking? Are we tracking the trajectory as opposed to just making and really a question for Mike. I mean, take a look at like the pre-calc. We're going to be doing this many times, and the question is, are we making comparisons to the first time that we do it, or tracking the trajectory?
Yeah, I think there are two forms of the tracking there. So if you imagine the student cohort that's going through, there's one which is like, okay, let's keep evaluating whether this course does well. That's one part. And then the other part is like, how do those students do in subsequent courses? And both of those are really, really important because, for obvious reasons. But I think that's like, we would even like to have been able to do this one where we just keep testing on those students that take that course. But at an institution like Georgia Tech, or in these systems where we really are trying to understand whether or not these types of interventions at the Gen Ed first 2 years really work, knowing how the students do in later courses seems even more important at some level. Yeah.
So we have a system-level task force now that's kind of looking at the future. And one of the critical uncertainties they have identified is that pace of change. And the idea of the pace of change, as you reflect on the Maryland work that you did, is that something that you're working as fast as the institution could tolerate? I mean, is there slack time in there that we could pick up the pace? Because the feeling is that things are changing a lot faster than we can keep up with it.
Yeah, I think. Gosh, that's a really hard question. So yeah, so I think the first part is that. I mean, in that particular case, the pace, I mean, we could only do one semester, and I think everybody worked very fast and hard to make that work. We didn't have a lot of time preparing, in terms of preparing, so I think it was dynamic in that sense. I think the question is really, there's no question that the environment, when you look at other areas, are making it possible to do different things. The question of the importance of the pace of change is more of a cultural question, like how quickly are there going to be alternatives that would be threatening? I mean, that's really, I think the important question, and that's that's so hard to predict. I think that when you look at what's happening, I'll just give one example. If you think about things like the cultural emphasis on small classes. It's possible, not demonstrated. It's possible when you look at the way that adaptive learning systems work with continuous feedback of data, or you think about the way that social networks operate. If you think about students actually grading up or marking up that this course was really good or this part of the course was really good. In both those cases, the number of students in the system, it's actually better when there are more, right? The systems work better when more students are in them, which is exactly the opposite of the way things work for face-to-face instruction. So the question I have when coming back to the question of pace is like, when will that be? You know, we don't have those systems really in place to take advantage of that, or to take advantage of that appropriately, right? So I think that the question is, how do you re-engineer that learning process so the parts that can take advantage of that the areas where more is better are used, but you retain the parts where face-to-face or small is better, and you figure out how to redeploy those. And so I think the question is, to me, that is where great innovation is going to happen eventually. And the question of how fast does it have to be is really going to be driven by the marketplace and whether people figure that out and they decide, well, we're learning more in this other space.
So the incentives go in completely the opposite direction. So status is tied to class size.
Right, and I'm not trying to say right now that I think that that class size is not important. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that there are things that need to be explored and understood better, where you can see that large numbers could actually prove to be an advantage. The economies of scale, the driving these things, that higher ed will need to figure out how to embrace, and that a simple view of, well, it's better to have a 1-to-8 faculty-student ratio or whatever. It may not be in the future. I didn't answer your question at all. Like, is that 3 years or 5 years or 8 years? In the future, will someone figure out how to leverage that effectively? Is I think a really key question, because that's where there's potential for both improved outcomes and lower costs. And if that's true, someone will find it. Someone will figure it out. If it's not true, keep going the way it is.
Well, I'd like you to speculate on some of those things. And I suppose there are two things in particular. One is the scale question that's been a part of a lot of the conversation here. And the other is the question of cost. They've been linked. But if we could separate those out, and if you could speculate on the trajectory of the different value propositions that you see, and then also on the different modes of scaling up, as it were. And from a time frame standpoint, I think we all have a sense that things are moving much more rapidly in a more granular way in lots of places, all simultaneously. And the changes that we've seen over the last 3 to 5 years have been fairly dramatic. Maybe that's an understatement or an overstatement, depending on your perspective. So I'm asking you to speculate on scale and costs.
Okay. So I'll start by saying I'm not qualified to speculate, but then I'll go ahead and do it, but hopefully not in an offensive way. So first, the one thing that you'll hear often is that in that upper quadrant, it's not possible to reduce costs. That's the first thing that will be said, that it's just not possible. These things cost more, you have to invest more, et cetera, et cetera. But the places that are right now, some of the places that are being innovative, everywhere I think is trying new things and being innovative. So I don't mean that in any kind of the ones that have gotten attention. So Southern New Hampshire University is an example, or Arizona State, or whatever. They have been able. What they've done is they've created online courses that they're charging either the same or a premium for. They're teaching way more students in those courses than in others. So they've expanded the enrollments with not a commensurate expansion of costs in terms of infrastructure or teachers or whatever. And frankly, they've made money, right? They've used that money to fund, in some cases, to subsidize the existing enterprise, and because the enterprise needs to be subsidized, whether it's the research enterprise or the physical plant or whatever it is, they're using those surpluses to fund those. And that's given them a great opportunity because they've had some resources to motivate faculty to try new things, and they've been working to change the culture at their institutions, and they have that opportunity. But implicit in that is that they're actually delivering that instruction for less, right, on a per student basis. I mean, that's how they're making money, quote unquote. That's how, and they're getting more students. So I think really understanding that. Now, some people might say, well, the quality of that education isn't as good. I think they would argue against that. I think they would fight back on that question. So what can be learned there? The problem is that taking those, it's so much easier to try something new and get the benefits than it is to come back and say, okay, we've got this infrastructure. How do we drive more efficiency or whatever into that infrastructure? That's a much harder question. So I first would say that I think that we just need to get people to embrace the notion that the opportunity for cost reduction is a worthwhile goal. And when I say people, I mean faculty, not just that administrators are trying to cut costs or reduce, but actually that from an institutional perspective, from a mission-based perspective, that every faculty member ought to be thinking, like, how can I do my job how can I teach students in a way that would actually make it less expensive? Not just that the tuition would go down, but that we would reduce the costs. That's, I think, because you can't get to a place where an institution can change its mode of operation in a way to do that. Now, I think there's evidence that says it can be done out on the margin. I don't know about whether it can be done within the infrastructure. It will take investments in changing infrastructure and culture. So I think that what we will see, I'll just speculate. I think that we'll continue to see some of what I just described, where institutions find that they can grow enrollments through this methodology. I think Georgia Tech is experimenting with that with the masters, right? And it's going to find, oh, how much can this scale? And the early players in that will actually make money, and they will invest in something. Right now, those early players are not investing in figuring out how to change their current operation in a way that reduces costs. They're not doing that. They're using those funds to not make those decisions. So I think the question is whether institutions can do that, because what's going to happen is those players that are out there doing that right now, and whether it's provided, for the most part, it's in providing various kinds of professional degrees, or nursing, et cetera. I think that that some of those will figure out how to change the way they operate on the campus to reduce costs. I think that they got to do it quickly, because that's going to become a competitive market. The other thing I think is going to happen is that and this is not speculating on something I know completely, eventually a very high profile university will decide that it can figure out how to reach out to 100,000 students, deliver its offerings at scale. Eventually, I think that will happen. Right, but I mean, I use 100,000. Yeah, ASU is very close to 100,000 enrollment. I think the world changes if Stanford creates a degree that all of a sudden, 200,000 students are in Stanford's freshman class, and or 100,000 students are at Stanford, and they're only coming to the campus for 1 year. That's a completely different competitive landscape, which I think has a huge impact on a lot of the 3,500 or so four-year college universities in the United States. So I think eventually an institution is going to get a leader that's going to say, we could do this well. So I think that's one area that I expect that will happen. I don't know, in the 10-year time frame. I think that we'll see institutions in the middle tier, that is to say, institutions that are dependent on enrollments. I think that we'll see, unfortunately, a good number of those won't succeed, because I think that these initiatives happening at lots of places are going to draw away students that go to those places. So I think over the next decade, you're going to see a lot of some number of hundreds of universities that can't, or colleges that can't continue to operate, and how to have that process be as positive as possible is I think a challenge for the community. That consolidations and I think you're seeing this in the system, right? In the Georgia system, there's been some reduction in the number of institutions. So I think we're going to see that trend. I think, the smaller privates and colleges that are dependent on enrollment are really struggling. So I think that to summarize and try to answer your question, I think probably it's in a weird way. One type of institution's gain is in this environment is a little bit another type's loss, right? You're not going to have a constantly ever-growing situation, but I think the institutions like this one have an opportunity, as Georgia Tech is pursuing with the Masters in Computer Science, to leverage their position, leverage your position to teach more students at lower cost, and that's, from a societal perspective, this is a good thing, and so I think we will see that. So I think the big question is whether or not it will be possible to figure out new ways to subsidize research, and the research and teaching complex to be retained. I think that's, hopefully we'll continue to find the money to do that.
Good, thank you, Kevin.
All right, thanks.